Morning all, I'd like to show you another excellent game from the Alekhine Memorial. Vishy Anand, the current world champion, playing against Liren in round 5, kicked off with e4 and Liren repeated his Karakan defence. We see d4, d5, knight c3, a very popular variation now. D takes e4, knight takes e4 and bishop f5. This is a very solid variation for black, where black is accepting a space disadvantage but hoping his solid position and counterplay chances later will justify the lack of a space. So bishop g6, we see h4 and something has to be done about the bishop. This is all theory. h6, knight f3, and the most popular move is actually knight bd7 here. This next move is quite popular as well, but some might argue it's giving white a little bit of extra opportunities. Knight e5, the main one, because of that neglect of knight bd7. And Vishy chooses this, knight e5, the bishop's tucked away, and now bishop d3. This is possible that the d4 isn't hanging because of knight takes f7. White ends up being better. That's a theoretical trap here. Just for those interested, I'll show you. Queen takes d4, knight takes. So if king takes, this will be unfortunately losing the queen. So this is very good for white. So here, though, black, he takes on d3. This has all been seen before. Knight d7, f4, justifying and reinforcing that knight. Bishop b4 check is the most popular move here again. It takes away the c3 square from white because white doesn't really want the exchange of bishops. The exchanges will favour black, with the lack of space to get piece exchanges, should favour black. So c3, trying to keep more tension in the position. The bishop drops back to e7. It isn't really a tempo loss because it's created a pawn which isn't ideal on c3. Bishop d2, knight gf6, and most players in this position before have routinely castled queenside. This next move from Vishy must have caused a little bit of confusion. Queen e2. It looks as though Vishy's got an intention of f5, and this might be prepared. So this is creating some maybe fear and anxiety at a psychological level for Liren here. What is different about this position compared to white castling queenside? Psychologically, you can imagine he's looking at all the nuances and the differences. What is the benefit of the queen on e2? f5 is the most immediate concern, perhaps, for black. Black's thematic break still is c5 though, and he does actually play c5 here. It's interesting to play f5 here. Vishy didn't play it, but perhaps we can see that after c takes d4, white might be able to play knight takes f7, winning a pawn, but it might be an academic pawn because after takes, king g8, e takes, queen takes d7. I don't think there's anything too much to fear here for black in this position. For example, rook e8 check, and even if black is a pawn down in this position, white has lots of weaknesses. I say queen's pawn. I think this should be okay for black. So here, this thematic c5 to give white the isolated queen's pawn is a real concern. And Vishy plays d takes c5, and now an ordinary move, bishop takes c5. I think there's nothing much wrong with it here. If white tries to play for f5 here, this could be a disaster. For example, knight takes, queen takes. Can you see the resource black would have in this position? If I give you 10 seconds, it's just a variation of the game. Okay, black would have the crushing bishop f2 check. This is not nice at all. So basically, I believe that bishop takes c5 is entirely playable, but I think maybe black was psychologically under pressure from what's going on here. There's queen e2 and dc5 and no castling queenside. He plays queen c7, which maybe is trying to anticipate white still castling queenside, and it will be beneficial maybe even to do a pawn sack if needed if white plays b4 later. But of course white doesn't have to castle queenside. Vishy supports the pawn, and now after black castles kingside, of course white doesn't have to castle queenside here. Vishy castles kingside. Despite, okay, there's a weak pawn here, but so what? This pawn, although it's like an academic pawn in some respect that it's double pawns, it's the squares that white has, like d4, the pressure that potentially could be exerted on the d file, like d6 later, if given a chance. For example, bishop e3, rook d1, knight c4 to d6, for example. So black tries to undermine quickly this structure before it can be usefully used for dark square pressure. a3, and now black makes a committal looking decision. Knight takes e5. After f takes knight d7, it seems, well, there's two pawns hanging here. Isn't white concerned? Vishy plays a move which shows a lack of concern for both pawns, and it's entirely justifiable actually. Very powerful move actually on very close inspection. The world champion plays the move knight e4, and whatever pawn is taken, whatever way, it just seems it's not that great in this position on close analysis. But we'll see the game continuation. But just to demonstrate, say bishop takes h4, then knight d6 is a very, very powerfully entrenched knight, and white has threats of queen g4 and bishop h6. This is not very nice at all, this type of position. White can put more pressure on that f4, and f7's an immediate target. Also, in the game, a takes b4 was chosen. If queen takes e5 immediately, then bishop f4, and it's very difficult to see where the queen's going usefully here. On queen d5, rook a d1, queen c6, bishop d6. Again, it's not winning the extra pawn in itself. It's like d6 is a major problem here. This is a very, very uncomfortable looking position. Exchange of dark square bishops, and that d6 is a monster knight now. So in the game, this is very difficult for black. Black plays a takes b4, and Vishy chooses c takes b4, and actually this has a lot going for it. Keeping the tension, avoiding the exchanges again, because white has the extra space advantage. Exchanges would usually favour the player with less space. So a takes b4 I don't think is as good. For example, taking queen takes, and here, after queen d5, black's looking forward to knight e5, and it's not such a problem. This isn't a big problem, just this rook on a1 in this position. So in the game we see c takes b4, queen takes on e5, and there is of course now the resource check because there's no pawn on c3, but bishop c3 stops any check there and is targeting black's king. Queen c7, rook a d1, and you can feel that the pressure is very uncomfortable here. This pawn, I don't think, can be taken for fairly obvious reasons, including queen b2, double attacking g7 and a3. So that's immune, this pawn here. And there's also a threat of queen g4, just probing g7 here. After rook a d8, in fact, queen g4 is played. And it's looking a little bit shaky, the king side. One has to say, black cannot arrange a normal defence here, like knight f6 is a nasty pin. So best, the lesser evil is probably e5 in this position. And you might think, well, hold on a sec, rook d3 is really dangerous, this rook left for rook g3, and you're right, it is dangerous. It turns out, black might be able to counter-sack a pawn here like this to save himself with queen g6, just like this. It's not the sort of thing which is pleasurable to play, but it's a lesser evil continuation. In the game we see a horrendous looking weakening move, absolutely horrendous, g6, and this looks like a total recipe for disaster, of course. this bishop on that diagonal with lots of dark square weaknesses. Knight d6. So immediately white seems to be threatening rook takes f7 with queen takes g6, mating because of that bishop cutting across the diagonal. So an immediate threat, rook takes f7, is extremely destructive here, supported by the knight. We see in this position black already looks quite helpless. If he takes on d6, rook takes d6, and there's actually a threat of rook takes e6 among other things for queen g6 again. The queen is not really helping king safety here. There's also of course doubling as well, but rook e6 is the most potent threat in this position. So this is to be avoided. If the knight moves, again, there's always rook e6, and even queen d4 is also a threat as well for just doubling on that diagonal. So this is a very unpleasant position here after this knight d6. And now black plays e5. Doesn't really help. A lot of damage has already been done in terms of weaknesses around here. And a very nice move now, queen c4. 3 pieces are now targeting, gunning that f7 pawn. Very, very difficult for black to do anything constructive here. If he takes the bishop in this position, then rook takes d6 threatens rook takes g6 check here. And the king can't move because f7 would drop. And there's hardly any defense that can be recommended in this position. So in the game, after queen c4, actually knight b6, the tricky knight b6, using the pin. But now the queen just goes to e4, and again renewing the threat of rook takes f7 now for queen takes g6 is pretty nasty. Or is it defendable with rook g7? Pardon me, the main threat now is not rook f7, it's actually simply queen e5, now that the knight's not protecting e5. But rook f7 has to be borne in mind as well, tactically. But here, black is mainly concerned with the e5 pawn and retreats back the knight to d7. But now Vishy uses his loose h-pawn as a battering ram with h5. This is not looking pretty. G takes h5, gives white now access to f5, which he uses, threatening now knight takes f7. Black tries to defend with bishop f6. Now queen takes h5. All sorts of threats, including of course queen takes h6, the most obvious. Queen c6 is played. Okay, now in this position you might think, well, maybe, you know, queen takes h6, but possibly bishop g7 here and black's living another day. But Vishy completely knocks out black in this position. Can you see the knockout blow if I give you 10 seconds starting from now? Okay, Vishy crushes the black king safety totally with rook takes f6, knocking out that potentially key defender if it could have retreated back. It's gone now. After knight takes f6, queen takes e5. Gigantic pressure, indefendable because of this knight on d6. Black's just indefendable here. There's no defense at all. And he resigns here. Just to show you from an engine point of view, it's just no defense. If queen e4, queen takes f6, well, it's just a forced mate. It's hopeless. So, just to show the effectiveness of anything else, if queen takes h6, I think the bishop can drop back, and black's living another day, but it's still terrible. It's still a terrible position, even in this case. But this was the clean, just knockout blow. Rook takes f6 in this position. So a fine attacking game from Vishy. Liren took too many risks with his king safety, and maybe was a little bit psychologically disturbed by this early queen e2 instead of the more normal casting queen side. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.